There's a moment when you realize you've been solving the wrong problem your entire life. Mine happened at 2 a.m. on Mulholland Drive, having a conversation with a coyote. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. I was pushing my bike down the mountain. Dead engine, no gas, no phone service. Classic stupidity. But about 2 miles into this long walk home, I heard something padding alongside me in the darkness. Kept pace with me for maybe 50 yards before I got curious enough to stop and look. This coyote, just sitting there on the shoulder, maybe 15 feet away, looking at me like it was waiting for something. Now, I've lived in LA long enough to know you don't mess around with wildlife, but there was something about this moment, the absolute quiet except for my breathing, the weight of the bike handles in my hands, this animal just witnessing my situation, and I started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because of how absurd it all was. Here I am, this guy who makes movies about chosen ones and legendary assassins, completely defeated by forgetting to put gas in his tank. The coyote tilted its head, and I swear to you, I found myself talking to it. You know what's really stupid? I said out loud. I've spent the last hour being angry about running out of gas, but I've been running on empty for months. That's when it hit me, not the gas thing, something bigger. See, I'd been having this relationship that wasn't working, career decisions that felt wrong, creative projects that drained me instead of energizing me. All these different problems I'd been trying to solve one by one, getting frustrated when nothing seemed to get better. But standing there in the dark, talking to a coyote, I realized something I'd been missing. I wasn't solving the wrong problems. I was asking the wrong questions. I'd been asking, how do I fix this? About everything. The relationship, the work, the creative blocks, even this stupid gas situation. Always, how do I fix this? But what if the question wasn't, how do I fix this? What if the question was, what is this trying to show me? The coyote got up, gave me one more look, and disappeared into the brush, like it had been waiting for me to figure something out. And now its job was done. I stood there for another few minutes, not thinking about anything, just feeling how different the air felt when you're not fighting your circumstances, when you're curious about them instead. Here's what changed. I stopped trying to be stronger than my problems. I started getting interested in what they were pointing toward. That dead motorcycle wasn't just about forgetting to check my gas gauge. It was about how I'd been moving through life on autopilot, not paying attention to the warning signs that I was running on empty in ways that mattered much more than fuel. The relationship that wasn't working, it wasn't about fixing communication or trying harder. It was showing me that I'd been trying to be someone I wasn't, for someone who needed me to be someone I wasn't. The creative blocks weren't about discipline or inspiration. They were showing me I'd been working on projects that didn't actually matter to me, wondering why I couldn't find the energy. One conversation with a coyote, and suddenly every obstacle in my life looked different, not like enemies to defeat, like teachers with something to show me. What I'm going to share with you isn't a system for conquering problems. It's what I learned about letting problems teach you things you couldn't learn any other way. Because here's what nobody tells you about obstacles. They're not random. They show up when you're ready to discover something about yourself you couldn't see before. The question isn't how to get rid of them faster. The question is, what are they trying to show you? After that night with the coyote, I became obsessed with something. Not the coyote part, though that was pretty wild. I became obsessed with this idea that maybe I'd been approaching challenges completely backwards my whole life. So I started doing something weird. I began looking back at every difficult thing I'd ever handled successfully, trying to figure out what I'd actually done. Not what I thought I'd done or what I told people I'd done, but what had actually happened in those moments when things worked out. The Matrix training, learning to embody Neo when I had no idea what that even meant, preparing for John Wick when I'd never done that level of action before, getting through the grief when people I loved died, even smaller things, like memorizing impossible amounts of dialogue, or learning to work with directors who saw things completely differently than I did. Here's what I discovered. Every time I'd successfully navigated something difficult, I'd move through it in the same way, not consciously, not because I had a plan, but there was this rhythm to it that I'd never noticed before. And when I looked at the times I'd gotten stuck or made things harder than they needed to be, or just completely screwed things up, those times had a different rhythm entirely, or no rhythm at all. It was like discovering I'd been speaking a language I didn't know I knew. You know what's funny? In all my years of interviews, no one had ever asked me about this. They ask about method acting, about preparation, about inspiration, But nobody ever asks about the actual process of moving through difficulty. Like it's supposed to be mysterious or different for everyone, but it's not mysterious and it's not different for everyone. There's actually a way that consciousness naturally moves through obstacles when you're not interfering with it. I started calling them movements instead of steps because steps sound like you do one, then the next, then the next. But this isn't mechanical like that. It's more like, have you ever watched a really good fighter? Not the flashy stuff, but someone who really knows what they're doing. They don't think about each move separately. They flow from one response to the next based on what's actually happening in front of them. Defense becomes offense, becomes defense, becomes something you don't even have a name for. That's what navigating obstacles is like when you're doing it right. You're responding to what's actually there, not fighting some idea you have about what should be there. Most people do one of two things with problems. They either spend all their energy trying to avoid them, or they attack them head on like they're in a war. I've done both. Neither one works very well. Avoidance just makes problems bigger and weirder. They start showing up in different areas of your life, wearing different disguises, and attacking them head on. That's exhausting. You might win, but you're pretty beat up by the end. There's a third way, and it's not compromise or finding some middle ground between avoiding and attacking. It's something completely different. What if obstacles aren't enemies to avoid or defeat? What if they're more like dance partners? You don't ignore your dance partner, and you don't try to overpower them. You respond to their movements. You stay present with what's actually happening between you. When you approach challenges that way, something interesting happens. You stop asking, how do I make this go away? And start asking, what's this dance trying to teach me? And here's the thing nobody tells you. Obstacles are some of the best teachers you'll ever have. Not because they're pleasant, they're usually not, but because they show you things about yourself that you can't see any other way. They reveal what you're actually made of, not what you think you're made of. They show you resources you didn't know you had. They force you to develop capacities that were just sleeping inside you, waiting for the right challenge to wake them up. Every obstacle I've ever faced has left me more capable than I was before. Not just at handling that specific type of problem, but at handling life in general. Like each challenge adds something to your toolkit that you didn't have before. The 5 movements I'm going to share with you, they're not something I invented. They're what I noticed I was already doing when things went well, when I was getting out of my own way and letting this natural process happen. Think of them as a map of how consciousness moves through difficulty when it's not being interfered with. When you know the territory, you can navigate it more consciously, you can work with the process instead of against it, and that changes everything. Not just your ability to solve problems, but who you become while you're solving them. When I was preparing for John Wick, I thought I understood what the movie was about. Guy's dog gets killed, guy seeks revenge. Pretty straightforward, right? Action, vengeance, justice served. I spent weeks preparing for that story. Then Chad Stahelski, the director, pulled me aside about 3 weeks into prep and said something that completely changed how I approached the character. And honestly, how I approach everything now. He said, so Keanu, everyone thinks John Wick is about revenge. The studio thinks it's about revenge. Half the crew thinks it's about revenge. But revenge is just what's happening on the surface. The real story is about grief trying to find somewhere to go. I just stared at him because suddenly everything clicked into place. All those scenes that had felt slightly off, all the moments where the character seemed like he was reaching for something that wasn't quite revenge, it all made sense. John Wick wasn't angry, he was lost. The dog wasn't just a dog, it was the last connection to his wife, to his old life, to who he used to be. When they killed the dog, they didn't just take an animal. They took his last thread, connecting him to love. That's when I understood something that changed how I look at every challenge. The problem you think you're solving is almost never the problem you're actually solving. I started applying this to my own life, and it was unsettling. All these situations I thought I had figured out suddenly looked completely different. There was this relationship I'd been struggling with for months. I kept thinking the problem was that we weren't communicating well. So I'd try to communicate better, more clearly, more honestly, more frequently, and it just made things worse. But then I asked myself, what if the communication thing is just the surface story? What if the real story is something else entirely? And that's when I realized we were both trying so hard to make the relationship work that we'd stopped asking whether it should work. The communication problem wasn't about technique. It was about the fact that we were trying to communicate our way into being right for each other when maybe we just weren't. The surface story was, we need to communicate better. The real story was, We're both afraid to admit this isn't working, so we're making it the other person's fault. Once I saw that, everything changed. Not just with that relationship, but with how I approach problems in general. Here's what I started doing. When something feels stuck or difficult, instead of immediately trying to fix it, I ask myself 3 questions. Not because I'm supposed to, but because I genuinely want to know the answers. First, what story am I telling myself about this situation? Not what's actually happening, but what narrative I've constructed around what's happening. Second, what if that story is incomplete? What else might be true that I'm not seeing or not wanting to see? And third, if this situation is trying to show me something I need to learn, what might that be? Those questions, they're dangerous because sometimes the answers change everything. I was doing this film a few years ago, and I was having trouble with one of the other actors. Every scene we did together felt forced and awkward. I kept thinking the problem was that they didn't like me or didn't respect my approach, or maybe just weren't that good at their job. So I tried harder. I was more prepared, more professional, more accommodating. Nothing changed. Then I asked those 3 questions. What story was I telling myself? That they were the problem? What else might be true? Maybe I was the problem. What was this trying to teach me? And I realized I was so worried about their opinion of me that I wasn't actually present in the scenes with them. I was performing my idea of what they wanted rather than just being there with them. The surface story was, this actor is difficult to work with. The real story was, I'm so in my head about their approval that I'm not actually acting. Once I saw that, I could work with it. I stopped trying to impress them and started just being present with them. The scenes immediately got better. Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting to the real story. It requires something that goes against every instinct when you're dealing with a problem. It requires slowing down. When we're in problem-solving mode, we want to act. We want to do something, fix something, change something, right now. But if you're acting on the wrong problem, all that action just makes things more complicated. I've learned to sit with the discomfort of not knowing for a little while, to resist the urge to immediately jump to solutions. Because the real story usually reveals itself in the space between recognizing there's a problem and deciding what to do about it. That space feels uncomfortable. Your mind wants to fill it with explanations, with blame, with plans. But if you can just wait in that space for a little while, something else emerges, something truer. Sometimes what you discover is that the obstacle isn't actually yours to solve. Someone else is struggling with something, and you're just caught in the wake of their struggle. Your job isn't to fix their problem. Your job is to stop taking their problem personally. Sometimes what you discover is that the obstacle is pointing you towards something you've been avoiding, a conversation you need to have, a decision you need to make, a truth you need to accept. And sometimes, this is the one that surprised me the most, sometimes you discover that the obstacle is life's way of developing a capacity in you that you didn't know you needed, patience you didn't know you had, strength you didn't know you possessed, compassion you didn't know you were capable of. The real story is usually more complex and more interesting than the surface story. But it's also usually more workable, because when you're dealing with what's actually happening instead of what you think is happening, you have a lot more options. Getting to the real story doesn't solve the problem, but it makes sure you're solving the right problem, and that makes all the difference. There was this moment during Matrix training when I wanted to quit. Not the whole movie, I'm not that dramatic, but I wanted to quit trying to be Neo. We were 3 weeks into fight choreography, and I was getting destroyed every day. The Wachowskis had hired these incredible martial artists to train me, and I'd watch them move like water, like they were born knowing things I'd never even imagined. Meanwhile, I'm 40 years old, trying to learn wire work and kung fu simultaneously, getting tangled up in cables, missing my marks, feeling like I was too slow, too old, too Western for what they needed. And I remember sitting in my trailer after a particularly brutal day thinking, I don't have what this requires. I don't have the athletic background, the martial arts foundation, the philosophical understanding. I'm not built for this. That's when Yuen Wu-Ping, our fight choreographer, knocked on my door. He sat down across from me and said something I'll never forget. Keanu, you keep looking at what the other guys have that you don't have, but you're missing what you have that they don't have. I was like, what do I have? I can barely get through a basic sequence without tripping over myself. He smiled. You have something more valuable than technique. You have genuine curiosity about being Neo. When you move, even badly, you're actually trying to understand who this character is. The other guys are performing moves. You're searching for truth." He paused. "Also, you're the only one here who's not afraid to look stupid. That's a superpower in learning." That conversation changed everything, not just about Neo, but about how I approach any situation where I feel completely out of my depth. See, I'd been doing what most of us do when we face something difficult, focusing on everything I lacked, all the skills I didn't have, all the experience I was missing, all the ways I wasn't prepared. But what if that's exactly backwards? What if the thing you need most is already there? You just don't recognize it as a resource. That willingness to look stupid while learning? I'd always thought of that as a weakness, something embarrassing about myself. Turns out it was exactly what made it possible for me to learn something completely new at 40. My curiosity about the character? I'd been thinking that meant I didn't understand him well enough. But actually, it meant I was still open to discovering him, instead of just imitating someone else's idea of who he should be. Even my age, which I'd been seeing as a disadvantage, it gave me something the younger stunt guys didn't have: patience with the process. I wasn't in a rush to master everything immediately. I could sit with not knowing. This became the second movement for me, taking stock of what's already there, but not in the way most people think. Most people make lists of their skills and resources. That's fine, but it misses the deeper stuff. The things that don't look like resources but actually are, like your sensitivity. Maybe you think being sensitive makes things harder, but sensitivity also means you pick up on things other people miss. You notice when someone's struggling. You feel the emotional undercurrents in a room. That's information other people don't have access to. Or your stubbornness. Maybe everyone's always told you that's a flaw, but stubbornness is just persistence pointed in a specific direction. When you're facing something that requires you to keep going when everything tells you to quit, stubbornness becomes invaluable. I was working on a film where the director and I had completely different visions for the character. It got tense. Everyone kept telling me to just go along with his direction, stop being difficult. But something in me knew that wasn't right for the story. My stubbornness, which everyone saw as the problem, was actually protecting something important about the character that I could see and he couldn't. Eventually, we found a way to honor both visions, and the character became more complex and interesting than either of us had imagined alone. Your struggle with perfectionism, that's also quality control. Your tendency to overthink, that's thoroughness. Your history of getting hurt, that's compassion for other people's pain. The second movement isn't about pretending your weaknesses are strengths. It's about recognizing that the same quality can be a weakness in one context and a strength in another. Even your past failures become resources. Every time you've survived something that felt impossible, you developed capacity you didn't have before. Not just skills, but something deeper: resilience. Wisdom about how much you can actually handle. I've been through some dark periods, times when I felt completely broken, but those experiences taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way: that you can feel completely broken and still be fundamentally okay. That's not something you can read in a book. You have to live through it. Now, when I encounter someone who's going through their own dark period, I have something to offer that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Not advice, but presence. I can sit with their pain without being overwhelmed by it, because I know from direct experience that it's possible to survive feeling like you're dying. Here's what I've learned. You almost never have everything you think you need, but you almost always have what you actually need. There's a difference between having unlimited resources and having sufficient resources. Most of the time, sufficient is enough. The question isn't, do I have everything this requires? The question is, what can I create with what I have right now? Sometimes the answer surprises you. Sometimes the constraint forces you to find a solution you never would have discovered if you'd had unlimited options. When we were making John Wick, we had a much smaller budget than a typical action film. That felt like a problem, but it forced us to be more creative with every scene, more thoughtful about every choice. Some of the best moments in that film happened because we had to find a different way to do something we couldn't afford to do the obvious way. The limitation became part of what made the film distinctive. Taking stock of what's already there isn't about being grateful for everything. It's about seeing accurately what's actually available to you right now. Include the weird stuff. Include the things that don't look like advantages but might be. Your weird background that doesn't fit anywhere else. Your unusual combination of interests. Your specific way of seeing things that other people think is strange. When you start seeing accurately instead of focusing on what's missing, something shifts in your relationship to the challenge. You're not someone who lacks what they need. You're someone with resources figuring out how to apply them. That's a completely different starting point, and it changes everything that comes next. I have to tell you about the worst day of shooting I ever had. We were doing this scene for a film I won't name, and nothing was working. Nothing. The director wanted one thing. I was feeling something completely different. The other actors were somewhere else entirely. We'd been at it for 6 hours, doing take after take, and everyone was getting frustrated. Finally, the director called cut and said, "I don't know what's wrong, but this isn't working. Let's break for lunch and figure it out." I was sitting in my trailer feeling like a complete failure when this kid from the camera department knocked on my door, maybe 22 years old, fresh out of film school. He said, "Hey, can I ask you something? What if you guys are trying to solve the wrong problem?" I looked at him like, "What do you mean?" He said, "Everyone's trying to make the scene more dramatic, but what if it's supposed to be quiet? What if the power is in what's not being said instead of what is being said?" I just stared at him, because he was right. We'd all been trying to push emotion into a moment that was actually about the absence of emotion, about characters who couldn't say what they really felt. We went back after lunch and tried it his way, quieter, more space between the words, more about what wasn't happening than what was happening. It was one of the best scenes in the film. That kid taught me something I'd been missing. When you're stuck, you're usually not seeing all your options. Most of the time, you're not even seeing half your options. Here's what happens when we face a difficult situation. Our vision gets narrow. We see maybe 2 choices, and neither one feels right. So we get stuck trying to decide between bad option A and bad option B when option C, D, and E are sitting right there, waiting to be noticed. I was dealing with this relationship situation a few years ago. Someone I cared about was going through something difficult, and they were taking it out on everyone around them, including me. I kept going back and forth between 2 responses. Either I confront them about their behavior, which would probably make things worse, or I just take it and hope they get through whatever they're going through, which was slowly killing me inside. Binary thinking, either or, confront or endure. But then I remembered that camera kid and his question, what if we're trying to solve the wrong problem? So I asked myself, what are all the ways this could work? Not just the 2 I'd been obsessing over, but all the ways. And suddenly I could see other possibilities. I could have a conversation that wasn't a confrontation. I could set boundaries without making it about their character. I could offer support while protecting my own energy. I could step back temporarily without abandoning them. The solution I ended up with was something I never would have thought of if I'd stayed stuck in either or thinking. I wrote them a letter, not an email, an actual letter. I told them I could see they were struggling, that I cared about them, and that I was going to give them some space to work through whatever they needed to work through. But that when they were ready to treat me with respect again, I'd be there. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't endurance. It was something else entirely. And it worked. Here's what I've learned. There are always more options than you initially see. Always. But you have to deliberately look for them. I started doing this thing where I force myself to come up with at least 5 different ways to approach any situation that feels stuck. Not 5 variations on the same approach. 5 genuinely different approaches. Like I was having trouble with this one character I was supposed to play. The director wanted me to play him one way. I was feeling him differently, and we were at an impasse. Traditional thinking would be, do what the director wants, or fight for my interpretation. But when I forced myself to find other options, I discovered things I hadn't considered. What if we were both right, and the character was more complex than either of us had imagined? What if the tension between our visions was actually useful for the character? What if we shot it multiple ways and let the editing reveal which approach worked best for each moment? We ended up doing something that honored both perspectives, and the character became more interesting than either of us had envisioned alone. The thing about multiple pathways is that you don't always have to choose just one. Sometimes the best solution combines elements from different approaches. I learned this from cooking, actually. You don't make a great meal with just one ingredient. You combine things that bring out the best in each other. Sweet and salty, soft and crunchy, familiar and surprising. Same with navigating challenges. Maybe you take direct action on the part of the situation you can control while accepting the part you can't control, while getting creative about the part that needs a completely different approach. I was working on this project where the financing fell through at the last minute. Traditional thinking, either find new financing or cancel the project. But we found a third way. We reduced the budget dramatically, shot it in a completely different style that worked better with limited resources, and ended up making something more interesting than what we'd originally planned. We combined acceptance of our limitations with creative problem solving about how to work within those limitations. The constraint became part of the solution. Here's something I've noticed. The path that feels slightly uncomfortable is often the right one. Not impossible, uncomfortable. That's usually your intuition telling you something's wrong, but the kind of uncomfortable that comes from doing something unfamiliar. If a solution feels too easy, it might be because you're avoiding the real challenge. If it feels impossible, you might be making it more complicated than it needs to be. But if it feels challenging and doable and makes you a little nervous, that's usually where the growth is. That's usually where the breakthrough is. I've stopped looking for perfect solutions. Instead, I look for experiments worth trying. What could I test for a week? What could I try without committing to it forever? This takes all the pressure off having to get it exactly right immediately. You're not making a permanent decision. You're just trying something to see what happens. Sometimes the experiment fails and you learn something valuable about what doesn't work. Sometimes it succeeds in ways you didn't expect, and you discover possibilities you never would have imagined. And sometimes, this is the best part, the experiment changes the problem entirely. You start trying to solve one thing, and you end up discovering that there's a completely different issue that's more important to address. The third movement isn't about being more creative, though creativity helps. It's about recognizing that reality is more fluid than our thinking about reality. There are always more options than you initially see, always more ways through than you first imagined. The question isn't, what's the right way to handle this? The question is, what are all the ways this could work, including ways I haven't thought of yet? When you ask that question with genuine curiosity, the possibilities start revealing themselves, and usually one of them will surprise you. There's this line Morpheus says in The Matrix, "There's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path." I thought I understood what that meant when we filmed it. I was wrong. I understood it about 6 months later, on the first day we shot the lobby scene. You know, the one where Neo and Trinity walk into the building with all the guns and basically destroy everything? I'd been training for months, martial arts, weapons, wire work, the whole thing. I'd studied the choreography until I could do it in my sleep. I understood every move, every beat, every moment. I was as prepared as I'd ever been for anything. And then they called action, and I completely froze. All the preparation, all the training, all the understanding, none of it mattered in that moment, because knowing what you're supposed to do and actually doing it are completely different things. I remember standing there holding this prop gun, surrounded by all these cameras and crew members, and thinking, I have no idea how to be Neo right now. The Wachowskis called cut, came over, asked if I was okay. I said, I don't think I'm ready for this. And Lana said something I'll never forget. Keanu, you're never going to be ready. Ready is something that happens while you're doing it, not before. That's when I learned the fourth movement. You start before you're ready, because ready is not a place you arrive at. Ready is something that emerges through action. We did the scene again, and somewhere around take 7, I stopped trying to be ready and started just being there, with the character, with the moment, with whatever happened next. That's when Neo showed up. Not because I'd finally figured him out, but because I'd stopped waiting to figure him out. Here's what I've learned. We tell ourselves we need to have it all figured out before we begin, but that's not how anything actually works. Not learning, not creating, not solving problems, not living. Action creates clarity. You understand your obstacle better after you start working on it than you ever will just thinking about it. I was putting off this difficult conversation with someone for weeks. I kept telling myself I needed to figure out exactly what to say, how to say it, what all the possible responses might be, how to handle each scenario. Finally, I realized I was never going to feel ready for that conversation. So I sent a text. Just, hey, when you have some time, I'd like to talk about something. That's it. I didn't figure out what I was going to say. I didn't prepare for every possibility. I just started the process. And you know what happened? The conversation was nothing like what I'd been imagining. It went in directions I never would have anticipated. The things I thought were going to be difficult weren't. The things that actually came up, I handled fine. All that preparation I'd been waiting to do would have been preparation for the wrong conversation. This is what I mean by starting before you're ready. You don't have to solve the whole problem in the first action. You just have to shift from thinking about it to engaging with it. Stuck on a big project? Don't figure out the whole thing. Just open the document, or clear off your desk, or make a cup of coffee and sit down where you're going to work. Overwhelmed by a difficult decision? Don't try to make the perfect choice. Just gather one piece of information, or have one conversation, or write down what you're actually trying to decide between. The goal isn't to accomplish everything immediately. The goal is to move from the realm of thinking into the realm of doing. Here's the thing nobody tells you about starting. Your mind will create an infinite number of reasons why you shouldn't start yet. You need more information. You need a better plan. You need to wait for the right time. You need to be more prepared. That's not resistance to the task. That's resistance to uncertainty. And uncertainty is always part of doing anything that matters. I've learned to expect that resistance and not make it mean anything. I notice I'm scared about this conversation. Okay, I'm going to be scared and have it anyway. I notice I don't know how this scene is going to go. Okay, I'm going to not know and do it anyway. Fear doesn't go away when you get ready. Fear goes away when you get familiar, and you get familiar by doing the thing while you're afraid, not by waiting until you're not afraid. The other thing I've learned, consistency beats intensity every time. I used to think that handling challenges meant these big dramatic efforts. Clearing your whole schedule, diving in completely, giving it everything you've got. Sometimes that works, but most of the time, what works is showing up every day and doing something small. When I was learning to play bass for a film, I didn't practice for 8 hours one day and then not touch it for a week. I practiced for 30 minutes every single day. Some days I felt inspired and played longer. Some days I could barely get through the exercises, but I showed up every day. That consistency did something that intense, sporadic effort never could. It built a relationship between me and the instrument, between me and the process of learning. Same thing with challenges. You don't solve them in one heroic effort. You stay in relationship with them. You show up every day and do something, even if it's small. Some days you'll have breakthroughs. Some days you'll barely make any progress at all. Both days matter, because both days are building your capacity to handle difficulty. Here's the magic of starting before you're ready. When you start moving, the obstacle starts moving too. Problems that seem solid and immovable begin to shift when you engage with them consistently. Not because you're pushing harder, but because you're learning things about the problem that you couldn't see from a distance. You discover aspects of the challenge you hadn't noticed. You realize some parts are easier than you thought, and other parts are more complex than you imagined. You start seeing possibilities that weren't visible until you got closer. And something else happens that always surprises me. Help appears, not because you asked for it, but because you're actually doing something. People notice when you're engaged with a challenge rather than just thinking about it. Resources become available that weren't there when you were just planning. I can't tell you how many times I've started working on something I felt completely unprepared for, and somewhere in the middle of it, exactly what I needed showed up. A conversation, a piece of information, a different way of looking at the problem. Movement creates more movement. That's the magic of starting before you're ready. You don't have to see the whole staircase. You just have to take the first step, and then the next one, and then the next one. Ready is not a destination you arrive at before you begin. Ready is what you become by beginning. There's this moment in the first John Wick movie where I'm supposed to fight this guy in a nightclub. We'd choreographed it perfectly. Months of rehearsal, every punch, every kick, every piece of broken furniture mapped out to the second. But when we started filming, something unexpected happened. The other actor, great guy, really committed, he threw a punch that was supposed to miss me by 6 inches, and instead it grazed my jaw. Not hard, but enough to surprise me. Now, the choreographed response was for me to duck left and counter with a specific combination. But in that split second, with my jaw stinging and the adrenaline hitting, my body wanted to go right instead. I had this choice: stick to the plan or respond to what was actually happening. I went right, improvised a completely different sequence, and it was better than what we'd rehearsed. More organic, more visceral, more real. Chad, the director, yelled cut and said, "Whatever just happened, we're keeping that." That's when I learned the fifth movement. You need a plan, but you need to stay awake to when reality is offering you something better than your plan. See, obstacles don't stay the same while you're working on them. They shift, they evolve, they reveal new aspects of themselves. If you're too locked into your original approach, you miss what's actually available in the moment. I was dealing with this difficult situation with a family member a few years ago. I'd thought through my approach carefully. I knew what I wanted to say, how I wanted to say it, what outcome I was hoping for. But when we actually sat down to talk, the first thing they said completely changed the context of the conversation. They shared something I had no idea they were struggling with, something that made their behavior, which I'd been taking so personally, make perfect sense. I could have stuck to my planned conversation, but what they'd just shared required a completely different response. So I let go of my agenda and responded to what was actually in the room with us. It turned into one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had. Nothing like what I'd planned, but exactly what we both needed. This is what I mean by staying awake to what's actually happening. Not abandoning your plan, but staying responsive to new information. I've started doing this thing where I regularly ask myself, what's different now than when I started? What am I learning about this situation that I didn't know before? What's working that I didn't expect? What's not working that I thought would? Sometimes the answers change everything. I was working on this creative project that I'd been approaching one way for months, making slow, steady progress, but it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. Then I noticed something. Every time I shared pieces of it with people, they were responding to a completely different aspect than what I thought was the main point. At first, I tried to redirect their attention to what I thought mattered, but then I got curious. What if they're seeing something I'm not seeing? What if the thing they're responding to is actually more interesting than what I think I'm creating? So I shifted focus, started developing the element they were drawn to instead of the element I'd been fixated on. The whole project came alive in a way it never had before. The original plan wasn't wrong, but reality was offering me something I couldn't have planned for. I just had to be awake enough to notice it. Here's something I've learned. When you're working on a challenge and you hit resistance, there are 3 things you can do. You can push harder against the resistance. You can give up and try something completely different, or you can get curious about what the resistance is telling you. Sometimes resistance means you're on the wrong track. Sometimes it means you're on the right track, but approaching it from the wrong angle. And sometimes it means you're exactly where you need to be, but the timing isn't right yet. The only way to know which one it is, stay awake to what's actually happening instead of what you think should be happening. I was trying to make this relationship work for way longer than I should have. Every conversation felt forced. Every plan we made felt like work instead of joy. But I kept pushing because I thought that's what commitment meant. Then I started paying attention to what was actually happening instead of what I wanted to be happening. We weren't growing closer. We were growing more polite. We weren't becoming more intimate. We were becoming more careful. The relationship itself was telling us something we didn't want to hear. But once I started listening to what was actually there instead of fighting for what I wished was there, everything became clear. Sometimes staying awake to what's actually happening means recognizing that an obstacle is pointing you toward an opportunity you never would have considered. When Constantine didn't do as well as expected at the box office, I could have seen that as just a failure. But staying awake to what was actually happening, I noticed something. The people who did connect with the film connected with it deeply. It had found its audience, just not the audience anyone expected. That taught me something valuable about the projects I choose. Sometimes the thing that looks like commercial failure is actually artistic success. Sometimes what looks like the wrong audience is actually the right audience. Staying awake means noticing these unexpected openings and being curious about where they might lead. Here's what happens when you get good at this. Problem solving stops feeling like warfare and starts feeling more like improvisation. You're not fighting your circumstances anymore. You're responding to them. You're dancing with them. Not because obstacles become pleasant, they don't, but because you develop this capacity to stay present with difficulty without being overwhelmed by it, to make adjustments without losing your direction, to stay flexible without becoming wishy-washy. That's when you know you've moved from just surviving challenges to actually navigating them, when you can stay responsive to what's changing without losing sight of what matters. The 5th movement isn't a technique you apply. It's a way of being present with uncertainty, of staying curious about what's emerging instead of being attached to what you expected. Because here's what I've learned. Reality is always more interesting than your plans, but you have to stay awake to notice it. I want to tell you about something that happened a few months ago that shows how all of this actually works in real life. I got a call from my agent about a project. Director I'd never worked with, script that was challenging. My first instinct was to say no. It felt too risky, too far outside what I thought I could do well. But then I caught myself. I realized I was reacting to the surface story. This project is too difficult for me. So I went to the first movement. What's the real story here? The real story wasn't that the project was too difficult. The real story was that I was scared of failing at something that mattered to me. The fear of failure was making me want to avoid the opportunity entirely. Once I saw that, I could move to the second movement. What did I actually have to work with? Not unlimited confidence or experience with this type of role, but I had curiosity about the character. I had a track record of figuring things out when I committed to them. I had collaborators who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Third movement. What were my options? I could say no and stay safe. I could say yes and try to do it the way I'd always done things, which probably wouldn't work for this character. Or I could say yes and use it as an opportunity to discover a different way of working. Fourth movement, I called my agent back and said yes before I felt ready, before I'd figured out how I was going to approach it, because I realized that figuring it out would happen through doing it, not through thinking about it. And fifth movement, staying awake to what was actually happening throughout the process. When my usual preparation methods weren't working, adjusting. When the director had insights I hadn't considered, incorporating them. When the character started emerging in ways I hadn't expected, following that instead of forcing my preconceptions. The whole thing took about 2 minutes. Not 2 minutes to solve the problem, but 2 minutes to move through all 5 movements and reach a decision. But here's the thing. I didn't consciously think, okay, now I'm doing movement 1, now I'm doing movement 2. It had become a natural way of approaching challenges, like breathing. And that's how these movements actually work. They're not steps you follow mechanically. They're a natural rhythm that develops over time. Sometimes you'll spend weeks in the first movement getting to the real story of a complex situation. Sometimes you'll cycle back and forth between the third and fourth movements, exploring options and experimenting with small actions. Sometimes a crisis will push you straight into the fourth and fifth movements, starting immediately and adapting as you go. The movements adjust to the speed and intensity of the challenge you're facing. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you feel yourself getting angry. You can move through all 5 movements in seconds. Getting to the real story, they're not attacking you personally, they're just in a hurry. Taking stock, you have the capacity to let this go without it affecting your day. Seeing options, you can stay angry, or you can wish them well and move on. Starting, you take a breath and release the anger. Staying awake, you notice how much better you feel when you don't carry other people's stress. But major life transitions, those might unfold over months or years. Each movement gets deeper, more complex, more layered. Here's what I've noticed. When you start approaching challenges this way consistently, something fundamental shifts. It's not just that you get better at solving problems, your identity changes. You stop being someone who has problems and start being someone who navigates challenges. That might sound like a small distinction, but it changes everything. When you're someone who has problems, problems feel like evidence that something's wrong with your life. They feel personal, overwhelming, like interruptions to how things should be. But when you're someone who navigates challenges, obstacles start feeling like part of the territory. Not pleasant necessarily, but familiar, workable. You develop this confidence that's not based on avoiding difficulty, but on knowing you can handle whatever comes up. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but adequately. Competently. And that changes what you're willing to attempt. When you trust your ability to navigate challenges, you can take bigger risks. You can pursue things that matter to you even if they're difficult. You can live more fully because you're not spending all your energy avoiding potential problems. But there's something else that happens that I didn't expect. When you get comfortable navigating your own obstacles, you become able to be present with other people's obstacles without being overwhelmed by them. I remember when friends would come to me with problems, I'd either want to fix it for them, or I'd get so affected by their pain that I couldn't really help. I was either Mr. Solution or Mr. Absorbed in your drama. But when you know how to work with difficulty in your own life, you can sit with someone else's difficulty without needing to make it go away immediately. You can listen without getting pulled into their story. You can offer presence instead of advice. And sometimes presence is exactly what someone needs to find their own way through. This is what I mean when I say that your own obstacle mastery becomes a gift you can offer the world, not because you become some guru who has all the answers, but because you become someone who's comfortable with questions, someone who's not afraid of difficulty. People can feel that. They can sense when someone has learned how to be with challenges without being defeated by them. And that gives them permission to find their own relationship with their own struggles. These 5 movements aren't just a method for solving problems. They're a way of developing resilience, wisdom, and presence. They're a way of learning to surf whatever waves life brings instead of being knocked over by everyone. The ocean never stops moving. The waves never stop coming. But once you learn to surf, you can work with the water instead of being overwhelmed by it. You can even start to enjoy the ride. And remember that night I ran out of gas and ended up talking to a coyote? I thought it was just a stupid mistake that cost me hours of walking and a lot of embarrassment. But 20 years later, I realized that night changed the entire trajectory of my life. Not because running out of gas was somehow good for me, but because being forced to walk in the dark with nothing but my thoughts showed me something I'd been missing. I'd been living like obstacles were interruptions, like the goal of life was to have everything go smoothly, and when things went wrong, that meant I was failing somehow. But that night, walking down Mulholland with a dead motorcycle, I discovered something different. The obstacles weren't interrupting my life. They were where my actual life was happening. All the growth, all the real learning, all the moments when I became more than I was before, they didn't happen during the easy times. They happened when I was pushed past what I thought I could handle. Not just the big, dramatic challenges, the small ones too. Every time I had to figure out how to work with a difficult director, or learn a skill I wasn't sure I could master, or navigate a relationship that wasn't working the way I expected. Each time I discovered capacities I didn't know I had. Not superhuman abilities, just more human abilities than I'd been using. Here's what I've learned. Obstacles don't give you qualities you don't possess. They reveal qualities you didn't know you possessed. The patience I thought I lacked, it was there, waiting for a situation that required it. The resilience I didn't think I had, it had been building quietly through every small difficulty I'd navigated without realizing it. The compassion, the creativity, the ability to stay present under pressure, all of it was already there. The obstacles just created conditions where those qualities could emerge. I think about some of the most difficult periods of my life, losing people I loved, projects that failed, relationships that ended badly. At the time, they felt like pure loss, like something was being taken away from me, and something was being taken away. I don't want to pretend that obstacles don't cost us anything, because they do. They cost us our illusions, our assumptions about how life should work, our attachment to things staying the same. But what I discovered is that losing those illusions made space for something more real, more present, more alive. The person I became through navigating those difficulties, I wouldn't trade that person for the person I was before, even if it meant avoiding all the pain. Not because the pain was good, but because who I became through learning to be with pain was more capable of being with joy, more capable of being with love, more capable of being with life as it actually is, instead of life as I wished it would be. Think about whatever brought you here today, whatever challenge you're facing right now. I'm not going to tell you it's a blessing in disguise, because it might not feel like one. I'm not going to tell you everything happens for a reason, because that's not something anyone can know. But I will tell you this. It's not just a problem to solve. It's also an opportunity to discover what you're actually made of. Not who you think you are, but who you are when you're tested. And here's what I've found. You're always more resilient, more creative, more capable than you think you are. Not because you're special, but because being human includes capacities we don't access until we need them. The 5 movements I've shared with you, they're not techniques I invented. They're what I noticed I was already doing when I was navigating challenges successfully. What we're all already doing when we're not getting in our own way. Getting to the real story. Taking stock of what's actually there. Seeing multiple ways through. Starting before you're ready. Staying awake to what's happening. That's how consciousness naturally moves through difficulty. That's how you've been handling challenges your whole life, whether you realized it or not. The only difference is that now you can do it more consciously, more intentionally, with more awareness of the process. You don't need to become someone different to handle whatever you're facing. You just need to become more of who you already are. Every challenge you've survived has been preparing you for this moment. Not because life is some kind of training program, but because every time you navigate difficulty, you build capacity. You learn something about what it means to be human that you couldn't learn any other way. The next time you face something that feels impossible, remember that. Remember that you've faced impossible things before and found a way through. Remember that the capacity to handle challenges isn't separate from the capacity to be alive. They're the same thing. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to be ready. You just need to start moving and stay awake to what reveals itself along the way. Because here's what that coyote taught me that night on Mulholland Drive. The path through isn't separate from the path. The navigation is the destination. The obstacle isn't blocking your way to life. The obstacle is where life is asking you to show up more fully. And you already know how to do that. You just might not know that you know.